Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today, we're going to be looking at something kind of unsettling. It's
Yeah.
this intersection of intolerance,
Mm.
mental health, and we're even going to get into this idea of mass psychosis,
Mm-hmm.
which, is this idea that a whole group of people can share delusions or irrational beliefs.
Mm.
So I've got a couple sources here today. One of them is this true crime story
Oh,
that is really going to send chills down your spine. And then we've got this academic research that's going to really make you think
mm.
about the state of the world.
It's definitely some heavy stuff.
Yeah.
We're going to be tackling some big questions today, you know? Are we more vulnerable to these kinds of things, these breakdowns in today's world?
Yeah.
And if so, what can we do about it?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're here to try and figure out. So let's start with this true crime case. It's out of Seattle. And frankly, the details are pretty disturbing. It involves this woman named Corey Burke, who was charged with murdering her father on November 5th, 2024, Election Day. And the weapon she used was an ice axe.
Okay. I read about that. It's hard to imagine that level of violence.
Yeah. So prosecutors are saying that Corey tripped her father, tried to strangle him, and then struck him repeatedly with this ice axe, using both the blunt end and the sharp end. And then after that, she sat with his body until he stopped breathing. And it wasn't until she started smashing windows in the house that the neighbors called the police.
Wow. That just sounds like a complete mental break. But, of course, we have to be careful about drawing conclusions when we don't have all the facts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We want to be responsible about how we're talking about this.
Yeah.
So here's what we do know. We know that Corey had been living with her father in Seattle. They bought a house together back in June of 2023. And investigators are saying that their relationship was pretty strained. There was a lot of tension around boundaries. And there are also reports that Corey had been exhibiting these signs of what they were calling hyperfocus.
Yeah.
And she seemed just completely overwhelmed in general. And here's another detail that really stuck with me. Detectives at the scene said that she appeared completely unfit to care for herself.
Yeah. That's a key point. It really suggests that there were some underlying mental health issues there, maybe long before this tragic incident.
Right. So this is the million-dollar question. Was this act of violence purely driven by mental illness? Or was there something else going on? Could it have been fueled, at least in part, by political intolerance? Or maybe even some kind of unsettling combination of both?
It's tough to say for sure. Without more information about Corey's background, her motivations, her political leanings, and, really the dynamics of her relationship with her father.
Right. But I think this case, as shocking as it is, really serves as a good starting point for a larger conversation about the link between societal pressures, personal struggles, and these extreme actions.
I agree. And that's where I think our second source comes in, this research paper from Columbia University. It offers a different perspective, but one that I think is really relevant to our deep dive today.
Okay, so let's unpack this study a little bit. What were the researchers looking at?
So, they were looking at survey data from a massive sample size, over 86,000 high school seniors, over 13 years, and they were tracking depression rates among these teenagers and seeing if there was any correlation between those rates of depression and their political beliefs.
Interesting. So did they find any connection between political ideology and mental health?
Well, this is where it gets really fascinating. The study found that depression rates have been rising among teens across the political spectrum, however. The most dramatic increase was among those who identify as liberal, particularly girls from low-income families.
Okay. That is interesting. Do the researchers offer any explanation for this trend?
They do. They have a couple of hypotheses. One is that liberal teens might be more sensitive to what's going on in the world around them. They're taking on the weight of these really big issues like political polarization, economic inequality, social injustice, climate change. It's almost as if they're internalizing these global problems, which then leads to this heightened anxiety and despair.
So they're feeling overwhelmed by a sense of responsibility or maybe even helplessness in the face of all these challenges.
That's the idea. And of course, we can't ignore the impact of social media either.
Right. Yeah.
You have this constant exposure to negativity, the pressure to conform, the fear of missing out. It all contributes to this sense of unease and inadequacy, particularly among young people.
Right. It's interesting to think about how this research might connect back to the Corey Burke case, because she'd been grappling with these same anxieties related to societal issues. Was she feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders.
It's definitely a question worth exploring. We don't have enough information about Corey's specific circumstances, but it's not a stretch to imagine that these anxieties and tensions that we've been talking about could play a role in making existing mental health vulnerabilities even worse.
Especially given that this alleged crime took place on Election Day.
Yeah.
A time of heightened emotions and political division.
It's almost as if...
Yeah, the intensity of that day, combined with her own struggles, might have just created like a perfect storm.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought. And it leads us to this concept that might sound a little bit out there at first, this idea of mass psychosis. We touched on it briefly at the beginning. But I think it's worth unpacking it a little bit further. Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating idea. And it's definitely somewhat controversial. But essentially it describes this phenomenon where a large group of people start sharing the same delusions or irrational beliefs. They basically experience this collective break from reality.
So are we saying that our society as a whole is experiencing mass psychosis right now?
I wouldn't go that far. It's definitely a complex issue with a lot of nuances. But I think it's valuable to consider how certain factors in our world today, like increasing political polarization and the echo chambers that social media creates, might be contributing to a kind of shared anxiety, this feeling of unease that kind of permeates our culture.
Right. It's like everyone's on edge, waiting for the next crisis.
Exactly. And when you're just constantly bombarded with negativity and fear and outrage 24/7, it's going to take a toll on your mental well-being. It creates this fertile ground for extreme ideas and behaviors to take root.
That makes sense. So how does all of this tie back to Corey Burke and this study on teenage depression? Could they be seen as examples of this shared anxiety that you're describing, albeit on different scales?
It's a really interesting question. And in Corey's case, we can't say for sure whether these societal factors directly influenced her actions. We just don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. But it is possible that this heightened political climate and the anxieties it produces played some role in making her mental health struggles worse.
Right, especially if she was already predisposed to certain anxieties, or she had difficulty processing these really complex societal issues.
Exactly. And then looking at the teenagers in the study, the researchers are suggesting that those rising depression rates could very well be linked to their awareness of these big problems. They might be feeling a sense of hopelessness or helplessness when they think about these issues.
Yeah, it's like they're carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders.
Yeah, and that burden can be really heavy, especially for young people who are still trying to figure out who they are and how to cope with things.
And we can't forget the pressure of social media, which can amplify these anxieties.
Oh, absolutely. Social media plays a huge role in how we see the world and how we feel, The constant comparisons, the pressure to present this perfect image of yourself, the fear of missing out, all of that contributes to feeling inadequate and anxious, especially for young people.
Okay, so we've got this tragic case with Corey Burke, potentially influenced by mental health struggles, societal pressures. We've got this research that's showing us a clear link between political ideology and rising depression rates, especially among young people. And this is all happening against a backdrop of intense political polarization, echo chambers, and just a constant barrage of negativity. Paints a pretty bleak picture.
It does. It raises some serious concerns about the mental well-being of our society. But I think it's really important that we don't just give in to despair or cynicism. We need to acknowledge these challenges, and then we need to focus on what we can actually do to address them.
So where do we go from here? How do we navigate this increasingly complex and unsettling world? And how do we protect ourselves and future generations from falling prey to all this anxiety and these potentially harmful behaviors?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there are no easy answers, but I think it starts with recognizing that there's a problem. We need to acknowledge that mental health is a really crucial part of our overall well-being and that it's really deeply interconnected. The health of our society as a whole, with our political climate, and even with the way we're interacting online.
Yeah, we can't just pretend that this stuff isn't happening.
Exactly. And I think we also need to be mindful of how our own actions and our own words might be contributing to the problem. Are we out there spreading negativity? Are we fueling the flames of division? Or are we actually trying to build bridges, trying to foster empathy, trying to create a more compassionate and understanding world?
It's about taking responsibility for ourselves and for the people around us. We need to break out of these echo chambers, challenge our own biases, and have these respectful dialogues, even with people who we don't agree with.
Absolutely. And, that also includes seeking help when we need it. There's absolutely no shame in admitting that you're struggling, whether it's with anxiety or depression or just feeling totally overwhelmed by what's going on in the world.
Right. We need to make it normal to talk about mental health.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure that the resources
And support
are available to everybody.
And it's also really important to develop critical thinking skills. We need to be able to figure out what's true and what's not, and to navigate this overwhelming amount of information that's coming at us all the time.
Yeah. Being media literate is absolutely essential. We have to understand how the information is being presented to us, who's behind it, and what their agenda might be.
And I think, maybe most importantly, we need to remember that we're all human beings, We're all connected by these shared experiences, hopes, fears.
Right. We might have different beliefs, different perspectives. We might come from different backgrounds, but we're all in this together.
We are. And at the end of the day, I think empathy and understanding might be the most powerful things we have to combat the negativity, the division. That seems to be everywhere right now.
It's a tall order.
Yeah.
But it's definitely worth it.
I think so.
So, to our listeners, as you go about your day-to-day, think about those small acts of kindness. Maybe it's reaching out to a friend who's going through a tough time. Maybe it's volunteering in your community. Or maybe it's just having a respectful conversation with somebody who sees things differently than you do.
I love that.
Every little bit helps. Well, maybe those small acts of connection will be the key to building a healthier and more resilient society.
I hope so.
Oh. That wraps up our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us as we explore this really complex topic of intolerance, mental health, and the power of human connection. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay kind.